Got it.
All right. Thank you very much. It's great to be back. I'm on the eve of a big reorganization. For a while there, I was just working for Columbus KTC, and then I had to get, real world stepped in, and I had to start getting jobs. And so I started a podcast and started working at the university and got a software job and started teaching in Santa Monica and Dallas and started a nonprofit organization. So things have gotten pretty crazy, and I recognize that I never along the way had planned my time or budgeted a time schedule, for hey, when can I relax in here and things like that. So tomorrow morning I'm starting this new system called Getting Things Done by this New York Times author David Allen. It's you basically, his idea, and this is why it immediately resonated with me, is because his thing is that we have so many open loops going in our mind all the time. There are things that we haven't acted upon, or vague ideas we have about things we want to do, but we haven't had time to think them through, or anything in our life that is preceded by a should or a would like to, those kind of things. And those loops are just kind of bouncing around unresolved in our mind all the time. And part of that whole soup of attachment going on. And his philosophy is basically get him out of the mind and into somewhere external, whether it's a computer or on paper, and then figuring out what the action is that comes next. But all that to say, tomorrow I'm going through everything in the house and everything in my mind, and it's all going on paper. And I feel so good just knowing it's coming, because I had swung far too much to the winging it side of things. And now it's time to swing back towards a little bit of planning. And I don't know if you've had that experience in your practices too, but it always seems like I'm on one side or the other and catching it when I'm a little too far to the extreme and then bringing it back. But so I'm feeling good about all of that and happy to be here. And so let's say the prayer of refuge. Let me see if I can share. It looks like I can this week. I'll put it on the screen if people need it. Is it showing? Good. Okay. So we'll say once in Tibetan, once in English, once in Tibetan. O Sangye Chidang Suki Chunama Chanchu Padu Dagni Kyapsuji Daki Jinsuki Pesunamki Drola Penchi Sangye Drupajo. Until I reach enlightenment, I take refuge in the Buddha, in the Dharma, and the noble Sangha. Through the merit of accomplishing the 6 perfections, may I achieve awakening for the benefit of all sentient beings. O Sangye Chidam Suki Chunama Chanchu Bardu Dagni Kyapsuji Aki Jinsuki Pesunapki Rola Penchi Sangye Drupajo. And I'll say a short prayer of my own. Om Baden Sawe Lama Rinpoche Nagi Chiwa Pediten Jula Baden Jempo Goni Jezunde Usun Jagigna Drup Saluso. Okay. So I actually want to start with potentially some questions. And the reason is because I want this overview examination of Chenrezig to be practical and to benefit not just your practice of Chenrezig, but potentially other meditational deity practices you're doing. So I have things to say, but I'm curious before we start if there's anything in particular that people have been wondering about, or questions about visualization or mantra or chanting or anything related to this kind of practice that we do, which can be kind of maybe the most opaque in a way. It's not easy to tell why we're doing these things, and the instructions can be vague sometimes. So I'll just open the floor if there's anything anyone would like to share. It's okay if not, but yes, Charles.
So I'm very curious about the dissolution of practices. I know that Chenrezig has a dissolution where kind of comes down from the top and up from the bottom into the center. But then the dissolution in Nundro, for example, all the different deities don't go through that type of dissolution. And then there's Tara and Amitabha and different. Can you address what the important parts of dissolution that you would see?
Yeah, absolutely. That's good. Yeah, I love that topic too. We'll get there for sure. Anyone else?
Adam, I think I said this maybe last time. There's always this thing which in my mind goes always on, and this is from I think one of the instructions from Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche, and I think I heard it from other teachers as well, is that the visualization doesn't have to be super clear, but you have to have the feeling that the deity or whatever you visualize is actually present. And then I start doubting myself, is it actually present? Do I give it the same feeling? Because it's not the same presence as I guess like a person, or is it the same as you would imagine as a friend of yours or somebody sitting there? So that would be interesting to be addressed for me.
Yeah, I like that. That's great. Cool, got it. Any others? And we'll have time for more later too. Okay.
Hello?
Oh yeah, Daniel, there you are.
Can you hear me?
I can. You're a little muffled, but I can make it out.
Can you hear me any better now?
Well, not really.
Okay. So I have a question about visualization.
Uh-huh.
I know that I'm curious why we don't just visualize ourselves as Chenrezig, or we visualize Chenrezig in front of us. Why is it we see ourselves as Chenrezig while Chenrezig is in front of us?
Oh, so if I heard you correctly, you're saying like, why would we visualize ourselves as Chenrezig while also visualizing Chenrezig in front of us?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, good questions. I appreciate it. Last call for now. Okay. So last time around, we talked a lot about the framework for these practices and how this fits into Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana path that we seem to take. As you said, as we all know, I think like we work a little bit on all of them, but ideally we're progressing Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana. And these Vajrayana practices, like I've seen recently in particular, how it's interesting that they can be a starting point. Like one can come and do Chenrezig on their first day at a Dharma center. But for some people, it's like absolutely not the right starting point. And I was actually one of those people, now that I think about it, because it definitely seemed like quite a leap to do this like visualizing deities thing when I had just started watching my breath. So I think we all have different propensities for what we're open to in trying practices. And there is an element of a leap of confidence and faith that is necessary, I think, to do these practices. Maybe not, but it depends on how you look at them and maybe what your background is with other religions could also inform that feeling of whether you're asking a lot of someone to do this kind of a practice. But part of the reason why it is so profound, and I think maybe the root of all the potentially mistaken views about it, is that it's dealing with the ultimate nature. Like we figured out, we didn't figure out, whoever made Tantra, which is a brilliant thing, the Buddha, I guess. It's amazing that this technology has been created and we have access to it. It's a means of connecting and interacting with Buddha nature, ultimate truth, non-dual ultimate truth. So it's gonna get a little fuzzy when we try to take non-dual ultimate truth and interact with it in a seeming form, and so I think there's where a lot of the kind of, I guess, like fuzziness is, because we think we're talking about two different things. We think we're talking about this ultimate thing, this Buddha nature, and we have this weird word non-dual, which we really don't hear anywhere else, and it's a little confusing, and it doesn't seem like our experience, because for you and I, it seems like you and I, and it seems like self and other, and it seems like good and bad. And so I think in the beginning, we learn about this idea of an ultimate truth and a relative truth, and we think they're two different things. And we recognize that, like, maybe I have some potential that's connected with that ultimate truth, and maybe I can realize that. And through meditation, we have experiences that make it easier for us to believe that could be possible. But all along the way, we may not be recognizing that the ultimate truth and the relative truth are not actually two different things. I mean, you could think of it, when I talk about these ultimate and relative views, this isn't a perfect analogy, but I like to think of like a spatial kind of analogy, where, like, if you're in a room looking a certain direction, that's your relative view of the room you're in. But you know that you could see that room from the other side of the room, looking this direction. And there's an ultimate sort of view of the room that we can't have, because we have this experience of being embodied in one place and we see one kind of way. But that relative view is actually an aspect or a manifestation of the ultimate situation. And Chenrezig is the embodiment of that. So to put it as simply as possible, like when we say vivid but made light, that's one of the means we're using to communicate that. We're noting that there's a form. It's clear, at least in the pictures, maybe not in our mind, but like it's clear. We see all the details, but we also recognize that, like, when we visualize, it doesn't look just like a tanka. And that's a question I get sometimes, that I think I didn't ask this one initially, and I probably should have, but like, do we visualize like in the picture on the tanka? Like, is it like that? And it's a funny question, because yes, but we have to also recall it's not 2D, number one. It's not a two-dimensional thing, and it's also not solid. So there is a little bit of a the tankas and the statues we have help us to generate a visualization, but it's not going to look exactly like it does in on the tanka. So there's kind of like, when we talk about an ultimate and a relative truth, there's an ultimate and a relative Chenrezig too. There's Chenrezig as the essence, like the actual situation of things, the ultimate situation. And then there's Chenrezig as a form, an appearance. And I want to look, I've got a couple quotes from Bokar Rinpoche here that I really liked. And shout out to Daniel for giving me this incredible Chenrezig Lord of Love book. It's been a big help for my practice. And if you can find it, I recommend it. So one thing he said is grasping the link between the two aspects of the deity, appearance and essence, is necessary in order to understand both Chenrezig's nature and the meditation. So to say that again, grasping the link between the two aspects of the deity. And he says here appearance and essence, but we can also say ultimate and relative, is necessary in order to understand both his nature and the meditation. And he also says, Chenrezig is the mind of being, Chenrezig is the mode of being of the mind that is the union of emptiness and compassion. So Chenrezig, when we visualize Chenrezig, think about Chenrezig, he is actually embodied bodhicitta. So he's embodied the mind of awakening embodied. So if we think about bodhicitta, if you've done Lojong or Tonglen, we have this ultimate aspect and this relative aspect. The ultimate aspect is limitlessness or voidness. And the relative aspect is compassion. So the practice of Tonglen. And similarly, Chenrezig is embodied emptiness and clarity, or emptiness and compassion, or lucidity and limitlessness. There's lots of words that we use for this kind of stuff. But one way that he said it here that I think gets to the point is it's about mode of being. So that's the aspect of Chenrezig that is the ultimate truth, and mode of manifestation. So we're talking about, this really is a practice of recognizing the unity of ultimate and relative view. So for instance, Daniel's question about visualizing self and front. We're ultimately trying to recognize the inseparability of these things, but we'd spend a lot of time in these practices working with the apparent duality of the situation. And that apparent duality we need to work with, because that's really the fundamental mistake we're making. And that calls to mind the idea of like the four veils. So like the question I think becomes, why don't we see that nature? Why don't we have direct experiences of our ultimate Buddha nature that often? They can happen. We've probably all had, luckily or hopefully, maybe a few in a lifetime, but they do happen sometimes even without meditation. Anyway, so there's four veils between us and that ultimate nature. The ultimate nature is unchanged, but our illusions and stuff get in there and they become like stains on a cloth. You know, they're not actually part of the cloth, but they appear there and obscure. So what's said that has happened is that at some point, this part still feels weird to me. This is one of these things that I know that I conceptually get it, but it hasn't really sunk in for me yet. But at some point we were overwhelmed by our nature. So, what has helped me to get this a little bit better is, and I'd invite you to do this for a moment, because this is something maybe we don't do enough as Buddhists. Take just a couple seconds and actually think about your potential. Like, let's take a couple moments and just actually kind of contemplate, what more could I be? What else potentially is in here that I'm not actualizing right now? And is it a lot more than maybe where I am right now? Can I perceive limits of it? Just take a couple seconds and kind of give a couple seconds of thought just to your potential and how big that could possibly be. And for the last couple seconds here, literally ask yourself, do I think Buddhahood's possible? Do I really think that's a thing? So I think this is an important contemplation, because I think right from the beginning we were told, oh, there's Buddhahood and you should all try to get there. And then maybe we learned to meditate and it helped a little bit. I'm just speaking with I statements, like I learned to meditate, I saw it help. I learned Tonglen, I saw that help. And I think kind of along the way, I just was like, oh yeah, and there's that Buddha thing, but I don't think I had taken much time to really consider that part of it. Like, what's my personal relationship with the idea of a potential of enlightened mind, So I think that's worth contemplating. But one thing you may have experienced, and this is why I went with this contemplation briefly, is it's a little overwhelming to think about that. So that helped me connect about the four veils and this idea of at one moment we became overwhelmed. Like, it's a little scary to start to think about that. And in that moment, it's possible when we become overwhelmed that we might decide to just distract ourselves, to do something else or ignore it. One way or another, we take some sort of action, to stop the overwhelming feeling. And what that was, primordially speaking, was we grasped onto the idea of an I and then called everything else other. So there's this moment of what we call ignorance, and that's not recognizing the true nature. And then because of that arises duality. And then because of that illusion of self and other, there's like an energy and a friction that forms. And that's how we end up with our negative emotions, because we start to bump into things that we want and we try to get them, and things that we don't want, we try to fight those off. And when we lose things we like, we get upset. And when we get things we don't want, we get upset. So there's this ignorance level, there's a duality level. Then because of the duality, we experience these negative emotions. And then the final veil to this ultimate nature is karma, the actions we take based on those negative emotions. So because we have those feelings of anger and jealousy and pride, we embark on activities based on our negative emotions, which are based on an illusion of duality, which is based on an ignorance of our true nature. And when we're acting in that way with the assumption of a self and an other, and clinging to that idea of a self, we're inevitably creating more suffering. So we kind of need to rewind that process. That's one way to think about some of the Dharma we practice. Initially, in the Hinayana in particular, we work with abandoning and karma. We work with stopping doing the things we're doing that hurt ourselves and other people. So we're working directly with actions, negative actions. And then as we do that, it becomes a little easier to work with the negative emotions. And that's with the Mahayana path, we start to be able to clear away some of the negative emotion. And the negative emotions go long before, thinking in terms of the path to Buddhahood as it's described in Jewel Ornament. The negative emotions go away much earlier in the path than the clinging to duality. So most of the Bodhisattva path is a gradual clearing away of all of that, more and more subtle ways that we cling to duality or conceptuality or self and other. So that fundamental illusion of duality is a really durable stain that takes a lot of work to clear away, and some, often many lifetimes and aeons. So it's worth starting to work on now and in everything we do. Like, that's really kind of one way of talking about the Vajrayana path, is recognizing that we're inseparable from that enlightened mind. So to get back to the Chenrezig side of things, I wanted to read one more quote from Bokar Rinpoche. He says that the relationship between Chenrezig as the potential of compassion in our mind and Chenrezig appearing as a divine form is the real foundation of the practice. On the one hand, Chenrezig as a manifested deity is charged with and transmits the power of the grace and compassion of the mind of all Buddhas. On the other hand, our own mind is endowed with the potentiality of love and compassion. Thirdly, the ineluctable interconnection that links everything causes the first factor to necessarily act on the second one and reveal it. So another way to say it is that the part, the Chenrezig as a manifested deity impacts and awakens our own potential for love and compassion. And he goes on to say, without the potentiality of our mind, the deity remains an external, beautiful and luminous, but ineffectual appearance. Without the deity, our potential remains ineffective. This is from the point of view of the path. However, from the point of view of the ultimate awakening, beyond the notions of external and internal and beyond any duality, no difference exists any longer between the deity and our own mind that is itself the Buddha. So any visualization of Chenrezig in this practice is us, but we're interacting in such a way that aligns with our current delusion. So like currently we experience things, most of the time it seems like there's a self and another. So we need some means to interact with that. So when we do a frontal visualization and a self visualization, we start as ourselves in the beginning of the practice, and then there's a purification where light rays come from Chenrezig and purify ourself and all beings of all obscuration and wrongdoing. Then we say the refuge prayer, and then there's a visualization where Chenrezig appears above our heads and the heads of all other beings, and eventually dissolves into us too. In this practice, there's actually several layers, right? Because you have a Chenrezig above your head and your Chenrezig, and there's Chenrezig in front of you. So there's always going to be some level of what seems contradictory, because we're talking about working with dual and non-dual, first of all. But in either case, so in terms of like the presence that Max asked about, yeah, I like that question, because to me that is one of the most meaningful things about this practice too. So the instruction that he mentioned is that the way I heard it, Rinpoche said that it's always far more important that we feel the confidence in the presence of the deity than to have a clear visualization of the deity. And I'm going to read a quote from here about when we feel like our visualization isn't that great, because he has a really good quote about that. But that sort of confidence in presence is another one of those weird, potentially, seemingly contradiction things, because we're recognizing Chenrezig as an inseparable manifestation of our true nature, and we're also having confidence that he's there in front of us. So there will always be like a lot about this, both in terms of the presence and in terms of the visualization, that's going to feel different than it does with a regular person. So for instance, to relate it to the visualization side of it, we're not looking upon a physical object with an eye faculty. So it's inherently not going to look like when things look like when we see them in real life. And that means there's going to be some sort of softness. We may not be able to maintain a stable visualization. We may not be able to maintain an entire visualization. Those things will get better, but even when they get at their best, they're not going to look exactly the same. And what he said about that I liked is, okay. Sorry, my quote's confused. Well, we'll try this one. So here's an instruction. This is a unique instruction for visualization that's in here. And this gets at what I was talking about too. So I had always heard instruction to visualize section by section and go from the top down. And, you know, to not worry too much if you can't visualize the whole thing or if you can't stay on the entire form. But he gives a really good instruction here. He says, when one begins to practice the phase of creation, one often has difficulty forming a complete image of the deity. Our efforts are divided. When one visualizes the face, the arms become indistinct. Arms in their turn chase away the face, and the legs obliterate the arms. One should, however, keep the mind relaxed and not fight oneself. Practicing in this manner, our ability to visualize will progressively improve. And so his unique instruction here is, he says, we should not approach this in a rigid or structured way. Avoid viewing the visualization of Chenrezig as building the wall of a house where each brick is solidly placed on the previous one and doors and windows are materially embedded in place. A good method is the following one. At the beginning of the meditation, one simply develops the thought, I am Chenrezig, and absorbs oneself in it. So we're starting here with that sense of presence, but that sense of self. So there's a recognition of our own inner nature of Chenrezig. That's the starting place. And he says, when other thoughts arise, bringing one back to the absorption of our ordinary personality, one uses the support of the visualization to regain the idea that one is the deity. For instance, one thinks, I am Chenrezig, therefore my body is white in color, and one puts one attention on the whiteness of the body. So we're connecting our sense of inseparability with Chenrezig to the elements of the visualization and connecting them even in sort of a cause and effect kind of way. Because I'm Chenrezig, of course, my form is white. When other thoughts distract us from the white color, then one recalls the implements one holds in the hands, and so on. When stability can no longer be maintained on one part of the visualization, one goes to another, arms, legs, face, and so on. Likewise, our mind becomes accustomed to a certain stability that is without tension. The visualization is then easy and agreeable. And he uses an analogy here about kids with toys. He says, when a little child is seated in the middle of many toys, he does not consider playing with all of them at once. He takes one toy and plays with it for a while. Then when he has had enough, he takes another that he in turn puts away to play with the third, and so on. He has many toys, but he does not worry about being able to play with all of them at the same time. He knows that they are there, that one toy is enough, and when he is bored with it, he can take another. And the meditation of Chenrezig is similar. You can move around from section to section. And as I said last week too, and I confirmed in here today as well, the mantra is also inseparable here. So the mantra is inseparable from the ultimate nature. He actually said it's the authentic sound of the ultimate nature is the mantra. So even just the mantra is an effective practice because it is inseparable from the form of Chenrezig, which is inseparable from the ultimate nature of Chenrezig, which is inseparable from us. So we're really trying to recognize that inseparability. And I want to check something here real quick because regarding Daniel's question, I should know the answer to this, but I just wanted to look at the practice text real quick. Yes. Okay. So I might have to check myself here, but I got a little tripped up because I was wondering about when we self-visualize and see Chenrezig in front of us, and I don't think we do. I think we become Chenrezig with a Chenrezig above our head. And then at that point, there's no more frontal visualization. I just want to make sure so I'm not giving the wrong information. Yes, so if you have the text, you know, in the beginning, we have Chenrezig in front of us and we are in our own form. And he purifies us with bright light. And then in that state, we say the refuge prayer. And then at the conclusion of the refuge prayer, Chenrezig merges with us. And then we do the visualization where on the crown of our head. So when Chenrezig merges with us, we're still us. We're still in this form at the end of the refuge prayer. And then when we begin the visualization, that's when we see the lotus with the Hri syllable on top. And I have a picture of that ready this week. And next, what I plan to do next time, by the way, is go through and do a guided Chenrezig practice. So we'll do this all next week, the whole thing. Where should we? There we go. So in this picture, you'll see the Shri is red, but it normally would be white. And this is above our head as our own form now. And it's white. And then the seed syllable transforms into Chenrezig instantly. And then we say the prayer of praise to Chenrezig above our heads and the heads of all beings. So it's kind of like at that point in the practice, everyone's in their human form and with a Chenrezig above their head. And then after the praises, that's where we imagine Chenrezig bathing us and all sentient beings with light, which transforms us all into Chenrezigs. So that we then become all Chenrezigs with a Chenrezig above our heads. And it's in that form that we do the mantra recitation. But above our heads can sometimes mean, I don't think it does in this situation, but above our heads can sometimes mean in front or above. And in fact, a lot of times you'll hear instructions that it can be either. Like it could be a little bit above and facing you, or a little bit above and facing the same direction as you. In Chenrezig, I've always heard it above and facing the same direction as you. But in that case, but we're still saying the praises to Chenrezig. And it's funny because it's kind of like we're on a circle here, right? Because it's like, well, that's me and I'm me and I'm praising. But this is, if we're going to work with duality, we have to do it in these ways that are virtuous and beneficial. So I think these types of things remind me of like when Khenpo Rinpoche says stuff like, when you get to the end of the path, you'll be like, why did I never even needed to do that. You know, it's like there was never a need to do any of this, but at the same time, we did need to do it, you know? So this is kind of like child's play. And that's actually a phrase I'm quoting Kala Rinpoche because Lama Yeshe Jamso told the story about how he was helping him with some big empowerment somewhere, some huge, I think it was in Washington, D.C. or something. And they took a lunch break and Kala Rinpoche took a little nap. This is the previous Kala Rinpoche. And I guess lunchtime came to an end and they had to wake him up. And Kala Rinpoche said, all right, time to get back to our child's games. You know, so there is an element of just like, we've got to play with the toys that are going to actually help us recognize the true nature. And in a way, that's what we're doing here. So I don't know what more I could say about Max about your question, but did that help a little bit?
Definitely, yeah. I'm curious, did I miss it? Did you address Charles's question as well with the dissolution?
No, but I want to get there now though. Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah.
Sorry.
Definitely. That's all right. Yeah, so we've talked briefly through these, and next time around, I'm going to actually because I've been doing this guided short Chenrezig lately, and I like it a lot. So I kind of, we chant it, and then I guide you through the visualizations in between. So we'll do that next time around, or at some point in the near future. But I want to make sure, at least on the third or fourth time of this series, that we actually do the practice and together and with questions and everything. So when it comes to the dissolution section, and the essential points of dissolution, the first phase of the practice is all generation phase. So that means we have created a visualization, and there's a recognition that we created this. We made this up. This is our visualization. It's happening in our mind. It's a visualization of the ultimate truth, but we know we've created it. And we should also think about the fact that, like, if we think about those four veils, we created this idea of a self too. That's our creation too. It's just that when we think of it as being the ultimate truth, it's the source of suffering for us. So we are creating all the time. And in the beginning of this practice, we create the visualization, and then we do the mantra recitation, the essential point of which is pretty much to recognize non-duality. We talk about it in terms of the threefold bearing. We talk about it as recognizing all form as inseparable from Chenrezig, all sound as inseparable from mantra, and the nature of all thought being inseparable from enlightened mind. And that's really what we're cultivating in the mantra recitation. We're either contemplating that, or we're visualizing, or we're saying mantra. In any case, that's what's happening. And then at the end of any practice like this, there's some dissolution. And I think Charles mentioned Lindro as an example of where there's some dissolutions. And what I think I found different about that is they are slightly different. And I remember asking, I think, Rinpoche about this at some point, because we actually have a couple forms of like guru yoga, which isn't exactly the same thing, where Vajradhara dissolves into us. But then we also do dissolve as Vajrasattva and Vajrayogini, I think, in the guru yoga. So it's a slightly different approach in Nundro, different from any of the other dissolutions I've done in any of these other practices. But in Chenrezig, which is a more traditional style, what the 15th Karmapa said is that that we dissolve into light and then into emptiness. So we have this series where we're Chenrezig's above our head. Every other being is Chenrezig, with Chenrezig above their heads. The way it starts is all the external stuff, the external world, dissolves into the Chenrezig above our head. So that means all the other people and the Chenrezigs above their head all dissolve into our Chenrezig. And then that Chenrezig dissolves into us. And then simply we dissolve into light, disappearing in space, like Charles said, like from bottom to top. Or we can do a more complex version where we have a Hri syllable in the heart on a lotus and moon disc, and we dissolve into that, and the lotus dissolves into the Hri, and the Hri dissolves from the bottom up. I think one of the most important points about the dissolution is this is a metaphor for death. This is a metaphor for working with our own life and death. There's a creation phase where we create our image of who we are, and what that's like. And then there's a working with the idea of that ending, beginnings and endings. And then when we do that dissolution and we dissolve into what's described as emptiness in here, when we dissolve into emptiness, we rest briefly until our first thought comes around. And then that first thought is ideally transformed into I am Chenrezig. Ideally, it's transformed into an immediate recognition that we are Chenrezig again. And we re-arise, as they say, as the deity. We re-arise as Chenrezig. And it's kind of like a rebirth, because in that moment, we've just had this experience of resting ever so briefly in the ultimate nature. And then a thought comes along, and then And you can kind of think of that thought as being what might be behind the four veils or not. You know, like that first thought could be something that we approach with some ignorance, and we think about duality and negative emotions happen and then karma. Or we could try to take that first thought and recognize that we're Chenrezig, you know, that we're not, that the essence of that thought is Chenrezig, and the essence of all sound is Chenrezig, and the essence of all form is Chenrezig. So it's a linguistic and a mental jujitsu, you know, but we are taking that first thought and turning it into behaving the way we want to experience behaving all the time, you know, in the mode, well, I guess the better way to say it would be in the mode of existence that we're actually shooting for, which is the ultimate mode, which is inseparable elements of emptiness and compassion. So there's a lot of these little non-dualities that are floating around. It's tough to talk about them all at once, but we're always talking about emptiness and compassion, or wisdom and skillful means, and those things are inseparable. So emptiness, if we think about the way it manifests in enlightened mind, that's compassion. That's compassionate activity. That's what that is. So I think too often we may get hung up on intellectually figuring out emptiness and kind of forget that the way it appears is compassion. Like that's the appearance of the ultimate nature of things. So a lot of these seeming dualities need to be kind of come to rest in union together. And to me, that happens in the dissolution. You know what I mean? That's actually when we stop thinking about this and that and self and other and above and below and all those things, and we just let it all sink into nothingness. We rest there briefly, but then there's that first flicker of thought, that first movement, that first wave comes rolling in, and that's what we use that for the purposes of awakening, for the purposes of enlightenment. And I'm trying to think if there's any other specific points about. Did I get your question, Charles? Okay. Yeah, because I haven't heard any more specific instructions on what to do with that dissolution, other than that simply dissolving or with the free syllable in the heart. But I think one last thing I would say is that dissolution, each thing dissolves into the other. So I know one mistake I was making with my practice was thinking that things were going away. Like for a while, I was kind of thinking that as Chenrezig disappeared, he was going away. But and what I mean to say is that like as he dissolves, it's all becoming part of, you know, so it's like things are dissolving into other things. So they're not like gone per se. But for instance, the lotus dissolves into the Shri, and the Shri is kind of dissolving into itself until it becomes like a teeny little dot, and then it's gone. So it's not really like when we say that like the Shri disappears into emptiness, it was part of emptiness, and it was emptiness before that too. It was emptiness all along. We're just visually kind of doing an exercise to recognize the way appearances seem to return to emptiness, apparently, you know, from our relative view. And one other thing that's coming to mind now that might help with this is, I think a lot of times when we get confused, it's when we talk about, and Dzogchen Khenpo Rinpoche called this mixing the realities. Like when we try to talk about relative truth in ultimate terms or ultimate truth in relative terms. I mean, we can kind of talk about both. I mean, and when it comes to ultimate truth, we're always just talking in symbols, because if we're using language, it's inevitably not capturing ultimate truth. But we can't, for instance, say that chair that you're sitting on is actually mostly empty space. Why aren't you falling through that chair if it's actually empty? You know, it's like, well, from a relative viewpoint, it's a chair. And as long as I have this relative, you know, mode of moving through the world, that's still going to seem solid to me. So we have to recognize that like that ultimate view and emptiness is actually inseparable from the appearance side of things. And that's also where like the ocean analogies, I think, help, recognizing that waves come from the ocean and return to the ocean. And when they go back into the ocean, it's not like there's some pointy wave floating around upside down in the water. It's like it just returned, So yeah, the dissolution phase is the most important part of the practice. I think I want to maybe emphasize that last, that taking the time to really let go when the final dot of the tree disappears and just rest briefly is your best chance of seeing that nature of mind. Everything up to there is there to create the causes and conditions for you to have a brief and authentic glimpse of the nature of mind, but you can't prolong it. So this is like a situation where, this is a don't call us, we'll call you kind of situation. Like you can create the situation for that glimpse, but if it's not happening, you move right on and you do that rearisal. And so all of this to say, like, don't try to prolong that or sit there or make it happen. You just let the mind rest. And as soon as that first thought happens, I am Chenrezig, and you're back in doing the dedications. So it'll be a brief but incredibly important moment of the practice, and the most important. And then we dedicate the merit and move into the day as Chenrezig. So I'll talk more about that. That's what I want to cover next time, is like the recollecting the purity. So like the elements of Chenrezig and what they mean, and then also the pride of the deity. So keeping that sense of being Chenrezig throughout the day and others being Chenrezig. And I would just remind you in terms of the post-meditation practice that all form is inseparable from Chenrezig. So that doesn't necessarily just mean people. It can mean anything, any form. All sound is mantra, in essence, the mantra of Chenrezig. That one can be really helpful because we hear a lot of things we don't necessarily like. So that's a good one. And, all thought, the nature of all thought is inseparable from Chenrezig too. And so when we talk about things being self-liberated, if you've ever heard that phrase in Buddhism, one way that we see that, there is no self, says Siri. She's right. Where was I? Okay, so moving through the world in our daily life, and when we have experiences of thought or physical sensations or sounds, things like that. Oh yeah, self-liberated. So just recalling in that moment is what we're talking about with self-liberation, because it's not like what we see will necessarily transform into Chenrezig. Not like we have we're going to now see everyone as Chenrezig because we're doing Chenrezig and they're going to look exactly like Chenrezig. But recalling in the moment that they're inseparable from Chenrezig is how we self-liberate these things. Just like recognizing that a thought that we may not particularly want to have or may not be particularly proud of, if we remember in the moment, the nature of this thought, not the content, but the nature is enlightened mind. And this is just a manifestation of that enlightened mind. We can actually self-liberate that thought in the moment. And there's nothing else that really needs to be done as long as we don't follow it away down a negative path. But that's really what we're talking about is just recalling in the moment is a huge leap forward. Like just beginning to recall is a huge leap that a lot of other people don't have. It's a privilege and a gift that we have. So any questions? Yes.
So thank you for your talk tonight. This has been wonderful.
Thank you.
And I'm trying to apply it to waking up in the morning. And I've been trying to do that because that's such a special time maybe we want to get up, maybe we don't, but the consciousness is starting to wake up. And maybe you have some suggestions about applying exactly this to the waking up process.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess it would seem to follow that you could create and generate your day like you would a visualization, right? Like you can, in a way, consciously generate who you are in your environment. I mean, granted, we have a lot of limitations, seeming limitations, but in the morning, for me, I've got next to my bed is the shrine. So there's like a table and then the shrine. And a lot of mornings I wake up and I open my eyes and I'm looking right at the Buddha statues, which is really cool. Like the first thing I see is that. But even if that's not the case, I always say a couple manis before I get up. And I always try to imagine when I put my foot down that I'm putting it down in a pure realm. Like that foot is stepping into a pure realm, and I try to imagine and think of myself as Chenrezig stepping into that pure realm. And then at least that first step of the day, is taken with intention and with recalling my true nature. And I try to do mantra for as long as I can, and including into brushing teeth and those kind of things. But it is tricky because we have that really magical moment where everything's fresh, and then those habits start creeping in, and those tendencies and the worries and all of that kind of stuff. So I think that's an important question, because the more in the morning that we can do to set our view for the day, I think the better chance we have of recalling and self-liberating things later on in the day. I think one practical tip I would give, because this is, a lot of people have said this helped them. I think I shared this maybe a couple talks back, but I think it's good in the morning to, as early as possible, think about when you want to remember your Chenrezig during the day. So like thinking about your day and thinking like, ooh, when am I really going to need to remember this? And planting the seed first thing in the morning. Like, I hope I remember when I run into that guy at the water cooler, like that's when I want to remember. And then when you move into the day, then that you've already thought about it once. So there's a better chance that in that situation that might otherwise have been potentially disruptive or challenging, you actually have a seed planted, and that being in that situation may remind you. And then you can kind of plant these little seeds throughout your day, these little reminders in the morning. And then in the evening, recall the times you did remember, and add a little inertia by rejoicing in the fact that you did, and recalling like, wow, that really helped, because then you're going to solidify the habit, and it's more likely to work the next day. And if it didn't work, try to think of better ways of doing it. There was a while there where I was writing myself notes, like just putting them in a book, like a Post-it, you are Chenrezig, and I'd get to that page like, oh, hey, there it is. So does that help a little bit?
Yeah, you're going to do that tomorrow morning. You said you're going to put your mind, everything. You did say you're going to put everything in your mind on paper.
Yeah.
And I did want to tell you back then, good luck with that.
Thank you. It's going to be a challenge for sure. I have a question for all of you guys, if we have time. I have time. I'm curious about this. I got a really good question from a student recently who is just started learning. They're not Buddhist, but they just started learning Chenrezig because they were curious about it. Their background is Christian, and I've already answered this person, but I'm curious for your thoughts, and to maybe as a different angle of thinking about this. They said, I'm not really comfortable with visualizing this form. Can I visualize Jesus?
Absolutely, right? If it's the right intention, I think if it's the right intention, the form becomes the right thing, right? I
Well,
mean,
besides, if all form is Chenrezig, then Jesus is Chenrezig.
Mm.
So
Mm-hmm.
there you are.
Good. Any other answer? I want to hear what everybody thinks, and then I'll tell you what I said. These are good.
I agree with Bruce. If all form, it does make sense. If all form is Chenrezig, then Jesus is Chenrezig. And I forget whose altar I saw. I think it was when the relics came through town many years ago. There was an altar set up, and there was a Jesus picture on the altar. Like
Mhm,
that.
mhm.
This question reminds me of that. I found that surprising at the time, but don't know.
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
What is that?
It sounds evil. Type it to us.
We
Don
can hear
Corleone
you.
is back.
Type it.
Daniel, you have very mafia voice again.
I know. It scared me. It's like a monster.
Forever hold
Yeah.
your peace.
It's a horror movie.
I love the Chenrezig.
Yeah, yeah. So
You know,
what I
I-
ended up telling. Oh, go ahead.
You know, I was focused on Vajrayana of about Yamataka and Guru Samaja. I also do a Chenrezig too.
Oh, good. Yeah. So I think in terms of, oh, wait, Daniel said, I would say that love and wisdom of Chenrezig is same as Jesus. Yeah. So I didn't exactly know where to go with the question, but then I started to think about the method. And I told him what Khenpo Rinpoche would tell me about any practice I asked about that was not the same as the instruction. Because there were lots of times where we would say, can we make this adjustment or that adjustment? And his answer was always like, I've told you, or the commentaries say how to do it correctly and effectively, and I can promise you results if you do it that way. If you want to do it any other way, it's unsure what the results will be. So that's the first answer I gave him. But then the second answer I gave him is I said, and I agree that, all form is Chenrezig, so Jesus is Chenrezig too. But if we think about the method of the practice, we're talking about a vivid and insubstantial form. And both of those aspects of the visualization are there to signify or symbolize relative and ultimate truth. And I said, I'm not sure that you want to visualize Jesus, because Jesus, I think that kind of the point of Jesus is he's the flesh and blood embodiment of God and the Holy Spirit, so it's like he is explicitly human, and Chenrezig is explicitly insubstantial. And so I actually kind of did a version of what you guys suggested. I said, I think that you should, if you can, work with the visualization of Chenrezig, but recall that he's the embodiment of all enlightened beings. And part of the reason why you may use the Chenrezig visualization and recognize him as inseparable from Jesus is because it's a tool of actually recognizing, but maybe, I'm not a Christian scholar, but maybe that's a method of recognizing the Holy Spirit. There's this element of the non-dual ultimate truth that we talk about in Buddhism, and we need we're working with some kind of form to recognize that, and the method we use is vivid and insubstantial, or limitless and clear. So I did say, if you can visualize Jesus like that. Oh, can you hear me still?
What?
Now
I hear
you're
my
taking
voice
it out
sound
weird
funny
way.
now too.
What'd you say?
I just turned his microphone off. I think it was Daniel's.
So, okay, so I have a question about that, because, and thank you, because that was a beautiful response that Khenpo Rinpoche often always brought us back to what the instructions were, and then not
Yeah.
speculating about, because there's so much speculation, but it appears to me, and I don't know if it's an appropriate response to someone like this. You were talking about the Holy Spirit and God and all this stuff. So at least this one might be an appropriate response, is that my understanding of Jesus on the cross was to take on the suffering of all beings in order to provide relief from suffering to all beings. And it seems to me that that was the practice of the Bodhisattva, to breathe in the suffering of beings through dark form and breathe out white light. And when you really think that he died on the cross in order to save beings, that is a direct parallel with Buddhism without the Holy Spirit and God concepts and other things entering into it, which I don't know. I don't know if Rinpoche would agree with that or not.
It is kind of like, I mean, I think what you're saying, right, is like we could kind of say that Jesus did the biggest Tonglen ever.
Yeah.
Right. Like, yeah,
I
believe that.
And ultimately, if we're all bodhisattvas, we're all going to be called upon at one point to have that same practice.
Mm-hmm.
And,
yeah,
I pray constantly that I'll be able to rise to the occasion when that happens. Because,
Didn't they say he studied Buddhism? He studied, I think Daniel told me that. Did you,
I've
Daniel?
heard that.
There's theory about it. But
Oh, I forgot he can't talk. Sorry.
The way my friend,
yeah.
Go ahead, Charles.
No. Go ahead.
Well, there's a friend of mine who's a theology doctor or something, and he told me at one point that, and this is like without evidence or anything, but he basically said the teachings of the Buddha were radical in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, but they weren't at all radical in India, where the Buddha was. And so during that time where he disappeared, I think that's where the speculation came from. Like, because it's kind of like Occam's razor. Like the most simple answer would be that he went where those similar teachings were and got them and then came back. But I don't think anybody knows for sure.
Oh.
Is that aligned with what you were thinking, Charles?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Daniel says, Wanchen Rinpoche said that the Holy Trinity is the Dharma. Yeah, exactly. That's the way I've always thought about it too. Yep, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Nirmanakaya.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I'd never heard that, but that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Nirmanakaya, exactly.
Isn't it amazing? Because I mean, we think about things like love and compassion. Like, of course, Christians believe in love and compassion. Of course, Muslims believe in love and compassion. But like, this is even like an even deeper similarity, that I think we probably don't talk about as much. Is this trifold breakdown of the holy. Very neat.
Has Buddhism been around the longest of any philosophy as far as the afterlife or anything? Or
Charles?
Well, no, the Sanatana Dharma means the eternal Dharma, which is what quote unquote we call Hinduism, and that's been around far longer than Buddhism. And Buddhism took many of the concepts of karma and different variations of rebirth, which was not related to this Atma, the soul, but it's definitely not. It's older than Christianity, to answer the question, and Islam, but not in terms. I think also the Chinese had different. There are all sorts of world systems that had epistemological origins way before Buddhism.
When did it get the name Buddhism? Because that wasn't in the Buddhist time, right?
Right. Well, yes, good question. I think it evolved really as a result of the councils that,
Mm.
where the Tripitaka began, where they were writing down the Dharma on palm leaves. And that's the term Tripitaka means the three baskets, where they began to record his different teachings of the Abhidharma and different, the Dhammapada and different types of teachings. I don't know when they started saying Buddhist, though. It's a good question. I mean,
That's one of those things I try to point out
Buddha
sometimes.
consider himself a Buddhist? That's it.
Yeah.
You know.
And that's the funny thing, because like, I mean, he, from the way I understand it, he found something that worked. And it's kind of like, I don't know, like if I figured out how to ride a bike and then everybody was like, oh, that's Adam's way of traveling. It's like, well, I just got on a bike. Anybody can do that,
He was pretty clear, though. What he experienced was beyond concept or beyond understanding of any being that existed in the universe, that he alone was the Buddha, the awakening. And that's why he walked around 40 days after his enlightenment to figure out if he should try to communicate it or just, but
Yeah.
he had put that many lifetimes into it and pretty much was compelled to teach.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Lama Adam.
Thank you.
This was very inspirational. Thank you.
Excellent.
Good. I appreciate the dialogue so much. Like, I love being able to just kind of teach a little bit and then to talk about this stuff with you guys.
Yeah.
So thank you. Should we dedicate the merit?
Yes.
Let's keep in mind as we dedicate the merit that being inclined towards awakening is itself a privilege. We're very fortunate to have access to these teachings. There are many people who not only don't have access to these teachings, but may not even have that natural inclination towards self-improvement or growth. So we celebrate that potential we have and that inclination, and we'll dedicate this merit with the hope that all beings can traverse the path and achieve perfect Buddhahood. By this merit, may we achieve the omniscient state of Buddhahood. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may we free all beings. May we free all beings. May we free all beings. All right.
Excellent.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Hope you get your mic
everyone.
figured out, Daniel.
Thank